The shadow of a parent falls upon every life, an inescapable inheritance of memory and expectation. But for Svetlana Alliluyeva, the only daughter of Joseph Stalin, that shadow was not cast by a man, but by a monument of terror, a shadow longer and darker than any other. Her name was a symbol, her life a relentless flight from it. Shortly before her death in the year 2011, Svetlana resolved to make a final, candid confession. For a lifetime, she had carried the crushing weight of a surname that had defined the 20th century, a name that had ground millions of lives into dust in its terrible gears. As she reflected in one of her last interviews, "I can no longer remain silent." What she revealed was a portrait utterly alien to the official propaganda. She did not describe the brilliant strategist or the benevolent leader depicted on Soviet posters. Instead, she unveiled a man deeply traumatized and profoundly broken. A dictator whose talent for destruction was not confined to nations, but was visited with equal ferocity upon his own family. Joseph Stalin was more than a man. He was an icon of Soviet might, an emblem of fear and total control. For decades, his image was meticulously cultivated through portraits, speeches, and staged appearances. In the West, he was the iron architect of communism. Within the Soviet Union, he was the father of nations, the patriarch of a vast socialist empire. But for his daughter, the man behind this monumental facade was someone else entirely. He was at once her adoring father and her jailer. Born in 1926, Svetlana was the sole daughter from Stalin's second marriage to Nadezhda Alliluyeva. On the surface, her childhood was a fairy tale. The hallowed halls of the Kremlin were her playground. A superb education was her birthright, and above all, she possessed the undivided attention of one of the most powerful men on earth. Stalin called her his little sparrow, his little hostess. He would allow her, and only her, to command him, signing his letters with the disarming moniker, "Your little papa." It was said that in moments of his volcanic fury, only young Svetlana could approach, could halt the eruption by clinging to his boots. But this was the carefully curated Stalin of her youth, the father who performed the role of a gentle parent. As Svetlana matured, the gilded cage began to shrink. The loving father's gaze would harden, and the brutal reality of the world he had built would begin to seep through the Kremlin's thick walls. The truth of a man is never a single story. It is a fractured mirror, reflecting both the loving father and the monstrous tyrant, leaving those who remain to assemble the pieces of a soul that shaped a century. The world beyond the Kremlin walls was a place of whispers and shadows, a realm where people vanished without a trace, where purges and mass executions were the grim instruments of statecraft. Slowly, inexorably, the chilling reality of that world began to seep through the stone, penetrating the consciousness of the young girl who lived at its very center. The atmosphere within her own home grew colder, the routines more rigid, the conversations more calculated. It became a militarized space, a microcosm of the iron-fisted regime outside. She would later recall, with a sense of dawning horror, that even the household staff held ranks within the KGB. Joseph Stalin's cruelty was not a tool reserved for politics alone. He governed his family with the same icy precision he applied to the state.
Welcome to my channel. If you are fascinated by hidden truths, lost civilizations, and unsolved mysteries, you are in the right place. Make sure to subscribe.
Controlling and manipulating them, demanding a fealty that eclipsed affection. While nations watched a statesman navigate the currents of global conflict, his daughter, Svetlana, saw a different man. She saw a father who systematically dismantled the bonds of his own family, who silenced any murmur of independent thought, and who demanded an unconditional loyalty that was to be held higher than any love. It was in the crucible of adolescence that this understanding began to dawn. Her awakening was the beginning of a profound psychological schism, a violent tearing between the myth of the leader and the reality of the man. In a moment of searing introspection, written in the solitude of her later years, Svetlana would give voice to this internal prison. You, Stalin's daughter, you are in truth already dead. Your life has already been concluded. You cannot live a life of your own. You cannot live any life at all. You exist only as a reference to a name. The rest of her existence would become a desperate, protracted battle to escape this verdict. She would flee her homeland, shed her name, and renounce the very ideology that had forged her into a symbol, a relic of a past she could neither own nor escape. Before her death, Svetlana offered the world a final, chilling clarification. It was not simply that Stalin was cruel. Of this, history had little doubt. It was that even in the most intimate chambers of the human heart, he was a void, a man utterly bereft of empathy. His empire was not built merely on the machinery of the gulag and the mass grave. It was founded first upon the ruins of his own house, and it began with the soul of his daughter. But the collapse of Svetlana's trust, the genesis of her lifelong exile, did not begin with a political decree. It began with a deception, spoken within the sanctified walls of her own home. November 9th, 1932. Svetlana was only 6 years old when her mother, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, took her own life. The official version, delivered to Svetlana and her older brother Vasily, was a sterile, clinical fiction. Their mother, they were told, had died of peritonie, constructed falsehood that their father would protect with absolute resolve for more than a decade. Svetlana would later confess that this singular lie about her mother's death became the defining moment of her existence, the fault line that split her childhood into a before and an after. It was the end of an entire era when she died, she remembered. Our tutors were dismissed. The home education my mother had so carefully cultivated, it all ended. The house changed. The people changed. Her departure from our lives was a genuine shock to us all. She added that she believed it was a shock to her father, too. Yet Stalin never spoke of it. For years, he refused to discuss his wife's suicide, erasing her name even from official biographies. For a time, it was as if she had never existed at all. A private truth buried beneath a public fiction. It is here, in the silence of a grieving home, that the great machine of the state reveals its most intimate and devastating power. For a lie told to a child does not merely obscure the past, it poisons the future, leaving a legacy not of ideology or power, but of a fundamental human trust, shattered beyond repair. The silence spoke to Svetlana. In the hollowed-out chambers of the Kremlin, it was a language of its own, a heavy, suffocating presence that told a story no one dared to voice. It was a story about her mother, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, whose sudden absence was explained away with the clinical lie of a burst appendix. Only years later, when Svetlana was a young woman in her 20s, did her father, Joseph Stalin, begin to make vague, clouded references to the truth. But by then, the wound had long since scarred over. The damage was irreparable. In the world her father had constructed, a world built on the foundations of absolute control, even the finality of death could be reformatted, edited into a more convenient fiction. When she finally learned the truth as a teenager, the grief of a lost child came rushing back. But this time it was poisoned. It was shrouded in the chilling realization of betrayal. A question began to form, a crack in the carefully maintained facade of her world. If her father could lie about something so profoundly personal, so intimate, what else was a lie? What other truths had been twisted beyond recognition to serve his narrative? The suicide of Nadezhda set the tone for, she wrote, they all disappeared, as if exiled from the home. With Nadezhda's passing, the last
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
vestiges of liberal and intellectual influence within the family were systematically purged. The warmth of a home was extinguished. In its place rose a cold, military precision. The house was now staffed by operatives of the state security apparatus, their true purpose hidden behind the uniforms of cooks, nannies, and maids. Every corner was watched, every word potentially recorded. Reflecting on that dark time, Svetlana never accused her father of directly provoking her mother's final desperate act. The betrayal, in her eyes, was more insidious. She made it clear that he had done nothing, absolutely nothing, to navigate the devastating aftermath. He obviously tried to understand, she would say, but he was a man of great self-control and not emotional. He simply did not possess the warmth that had been her mother's essence, the very quality that had made their private world bearable. The loss of her mother and the state-sanctioned but a deeply personal one. It forged her identity in the crucible of a lie and gave her the first terrifying glimpse of the man her father truly was. A man who valued absolute control over human connection, even with his own children. By the age of 16, the meticulously constructed image of the benevolent, powerful father began to shatter. It was not just the whispers about disappearing relatives or the quiet, simmering tension that permeated the Kremlin's walls. It was something far more personal. The breaking point arrived in the form of first love. His name was Alexei Kapler, a celebrated Jewish filmmaker and journalist, a man of intellect and charm, nearly 40 years old. Svetlana was still a teenager, and by all accounts, their relationship was one of platonic affection and intellectual discovery. He opened her mind to a world of art and literature that existed beyond the rigid confines of Soviet dogma. But for Stalin, this was not a romance, it was a threat. He did not merely disapprove of the age difference or of Kapler's ethnicity. He saw in his daughter's choice an unforgivable act of defiance. He was enraged that she had dared to exercise her own will, to form an attachment in a realm he believed was his and his alone to command. His reaction was not the outburst of an angry father. It was the cold, calculated response of a tyrant. In 1943, Alexei Kapler was arrested. He was exiled to Vorkuta, a name that had become a synonym for suffering, a frozen city of labor camps nestled deep within the Arctic Circle. When his initial sentence expired, he was not released. He was simply transferred to another camp in Inter, his existence erased from public life. There was no official trial, no possibility of appeal. There was only removal. His crime was not political dissent or conspiracy. His crime was to have captured the heart of Stalin's daughter. It was in this moment of brutal, state-enforced heartbreak that the last illusion died. It was then, Svetlana would say, that her father finally broke her life. The private world of the family and the public world of the state had merged into one terrifying reality, where a father's love was indistinguishable from a dictator's control, and a daughter's heart was just another territory to be conquered and pacified. The punishment of Alexei Kapler was not merely an act of state power, it was an intimate, personal assault. For the first time, Svetlana Alliluyeva was beginning to understand that the tendrils of her father's control did not stop at the desks of generals or the offices of bureaucrats. They reached into the most private of realms, into her heart, her personal choices, her future. The realization that love itself could be forbidden, that she was not permitted to choose her own path, became a profound psychological schism. The protective cocoon of fatherly affection, which had enveloped her entire childhood, was violently torn away. In its place stood a chilling clarity. She now saw her father for what he truly was.
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
A ruthless, cold-blooded figure, pathologically obsessed with dominion, even within the walls of his own home. This single moment would haunt Svetlana for decades. It was more than a point of political awakening. It was a betrayal of a far deeper, more primal kind, a wound that pierced her very consciousness as a daughter and sowed the first resilient seeds of a future rebellion. Many years later, reflecting on a life defined by that shadow, she would declare, "I can no longer be silent." This was not just a political pronouncement. It was a deeply emotional, familial exorcism. By then, Stalin had long been dead. The Soviet regime he forged had calcified into a colossal machine of propaganda and control. But for Svetlana, the need to speak was not an ideological crusade. It was a fundamental drive for survival. To remain silent was to allow her own history, her own humanity, to be erased by the myth. In the public square, Stalin remained a figure of reverence. His portrait still adorned the flags and facades of the empire he had built on fear. But Svetlana chose to reveal the truth, beginning with the insidious way his absolute power had infiltrated the most personal aspects of life, her life. What he did to Kapler was not simply cruel, it was demonstrative. It revealed to the world a man who perceived the burgeoning autonomy of his own daughter as an enemy force, one that had to be neutralized, to be crushed. And there is one final detail that casts the story in an even more tragic light. After Stalin's death, Svetlana and Kapler reconnected. Their relationship resumed, an intermittent current of affection flowing through that Kapler had been the one true love of her life. That admission, viewed in retrospect, exposes the staggering depth of the initial wound. Stalin had not merely shattered a teenage romance. He had attempted to annihilate something authentic, durable, and profoundly human. This was the point of no return. After the Kapler affair, there was no path back to the daughter she had been. She would go on to marry again, to change her name, and ultimately to flee the country that her father had defined. But the first true act of her rebellion did not take place at a press conference in a foreign land. It occurred in the silent, devastating aftermath of a love destroyed by the unassailable will of a tyrant. Svetlana Alliluyeva was not raised in an ordinary family. Her home was the Kremlin itself, a world where the family dinner table was perpetually flanked by guards, political advisors, and servants who were, in reality, informants. In this gilded cage, every word was weighed, every glance scrutinized. It was an existence devoid of genuine privacy, a childhood where the personal was always political. The destruction of her first love was not just an injustice, it was the ultimate violation in a life that had known nothing but control. For in the shadow of absolute power, the first casualty is not truth, but trust. And the deepest betrayals are not matters of state, but matters of the heart. Even within this fortress of absolute power, an insidious fear permeated the stone walls. and in the end, it would devour everything. The 1930s were a decade stained by the Great Purge, a campaign of political terror Stalin unleashed upon the Soviet Union. It was a maelstrom that saw millions arrested, exiled to the frozen gulags, or executed with a single shot to the back of the head. But for the young Svetlana, living inside the Kremlin, this was not a distant political storm. It was the quiet, inexplicable disappearance of faces she knew. The purge had come home. It began with the officials and the party elite, but soon the circle tightened, consuming people she had known her entire life. Members of her own family, the household staff, friends who had once shared laughter in these very rooms. Decades later, the memory remained etched with a child's clarity. Of course, it was in the 30s, she recalled. 1938, 1937,
And now comes the part no one talks about.
1936. Because in our family, the first to vanish were uncles and aunts. And I was a child. I simply saw that they were gone. One of these phantoms was her uncle, Stanislav Vedens, the husband of her aunt Anna. He was executed in the year 1940. Her aunt disappeared into the labyrinthine prison system shortly thereafter. The invisible walls rose higher. Even her beloved grandmother was suddenly forbidden to visit, cut off from her grandchildren by an unspoken decree. The atmosphere within the family apartments grew heavy, suffocating. Tutors were dismissed without reason. Teachers vanished overnight. As Svetlana later revealed, a new and altogether different breed of attendant was brought in. They were, in her words, servants with military ranks and secret connections. The real housekeeper, she recounted, a German woman hired by my mother, a wonderful woman. She was fired. In her place, a younger woman arrived, an agent of the KGB. Soon, all of them, the cooks, the maids, the drivers, held rank within the secret police. The Kremlin had become a theater of silent observation, where every word spoken, every gesture made, was noted and filed away. The very paranoia that Stalin had weaponized against an entire nation had now coiled back, infesting his own private world. And at the epicenter of this waking nightmare lived a little girl. Even her education, once encouraged by her mother as a path to enlightenment, was reforged into an instrument of control. After her mother Nadezhda's suicide, Svetlana's intellectual freedom was systematically dismantled. She was compelled to study history and political science, subjects that served the state's narrative. Her true passion was literature, a world of ideas and emotions beyond the regime's grasp. But her father forbade it. He considered the arts a frivolous indulgence, a dangerous distraction. His daughter was not to be an individual capable of free thought. She was to be an asset, an instrument of the state.
Stay with me. Because what comes next has been hidden for a very long time. And only a few people know the truth behind it.
On this crucible of control, a terrible understanding began to form, a realization that would haunt Svetlana for the rest of her life. She had never been free. From the moment of her birth, her existence had been defined not by her own will, but by the architecture of her father's regime, a control that was not merely ideological, but deeply emotional and physical. She would come to understand that the true measure of Joseph Stalin was not found solely in the blood-soaked archives of his political terror. The answer lay in the quiet, daily corrosions of the human spirit that took place within a home ruled by fear. Here, the most fundamental elements of life, love, knowledge, the simple bonds of family, were themselves corrupted, twisted into mechanics of control. By the time she could fully articulate this horror, the damage was already done. For Svetlana Alliluyeva, the rebellion, when it finally came, would not begin with politics. It would begin with the most fundamental human acts, the search for love and the desperate struggle for a self. Her marriages were never just relationships. They were declarations of an identity straining to be born. They were not ceremonies of love, but declarations of independence, each a quiet, desperate rebellion against the man who sought to orchestrate every facet of her existence. For Svetlana Alliluyeva, to marry was to break a shackle, to choose a path her father had not drawn. And each of these unions chipped away at Joseph Stalin's monolithic self-perception as the sole, unassailable master of his daughter's destiny. Her first act of defiance came in 1944 as the world burned. The man she chose was Grigory Morozov, a fellow student at Moscow University, and in her father's eyes, a man with an unforgivable flaw. He was Jewish. Stalin, the architect of an empire, refused to even meet him. The Kremlin walls, which had contained her Taishan from her father, the message was etched in ice. Any step taken without his explicit blessing would carry a heavy price. A son, Yosif, was born to them in 1945, but the union, born under such a dark star, dissolved just 2 years later. Yet, in a testament to the life she was trying to build for herself, Svetlana and Morozov remained close friends, the first true sign that she would forge relationships on her own terms, not his. The Kremlin, however, always strikes back. Shortly after, a second marriage was arranged. This was not a matter of the heart, but a strategic move to pull the errant princess back into the fold. In 1949, she was wed to Yuri Zhdanov, the son of Andrei Zhdanov, Stalin's own right-hand man and cultural enforcer. It was a union forged in the crucible of politics, a public display of restored order. But behind the facade, the arrangement was rotten. Yuri was a man caught between titans, utterly dominated by his own formidable mother, Zinaida, a woman about whom even the great dictator himself felt compelled to warn his daughter. He was under his mother's complete control, Svetlana would later recall, a puppet in a drama far larger than their own lives. This marriage, too, crumbled quickly, but not before the birth of a daughter, Yekaterina, in 1950.
This is where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear might explain why this was never meant to be discovered.
By the time Stalin's iron reign ended with his death in 1953, Svetlana was a woman adrift. She had weathered 2 failed marriages, the ghost of a first love brutally extinguished by the state, and years of profound psychological isolation. She was still young, yet the lens through which she viewed her father had been irrevocably altered. The comforting image of the loving papa from her childhood had dissolved, revealing the chilling silhouette of the tyrant beneath. He was a very simple man, she would reflect in her later years, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of disillusionment. Very coarse, very cruel. She no longer tried to reconcile the 2 figures, the father who had bounced her on his knee and the political monster feared by millions were, she now understood, one and the same. His affection had never been a gift. It was a tool, another instrument of control, bestowed only when it served his absolute sense of ownership. In 1962, she married again. This time, her choice was Ivan Svanidze, the nephew of Stalin's first beloved wife. In a final spiritual act of defiance against the atheist state her father had built, they were wed in a church. But the system had already claimed its victim. Ivan, a man weakened and hollowed out by years of internal exile, was a ghost of the gulag. He was emotionally distant, physically frail, a man broken by the very regime his new wife's name represented. Their parting was swift, but it marked another milestone in Svetlana's long march towards selfhood. She was making choices, unwise perhaps, but hers alone, that the Soviet machine would never have sanctioned. Later, having defected to a world her father had deemed the ultimate enemy, she made one last attempt to build a life free from his shadow. In America, she wed the architect William Wesley Peters. She shed her name, the name that was both a privilege and a curse, and became Lana Peters, a simple, anonymous woman from nowhere. The marriage was fleeting, but from it came a daughter, Olga, whom Svetlana adored with a fierce, protective love. Each marriage, each new name, was an act of personal revolution. Yet none of it was enough. The control Stalin wielded did not end with his death. It was a ghost that haunted her every step. It was coded into her very name, woven into the fabric of her relationships, and passed down to the children she brought into the world. But in the end, Svetlana Alliluyeva claimed the only victory that was ever truly available to her. She could not erase the shadow, but she could, and she did, turn to face it, ensuring the world saw the man who cast it for what he truly was. Her life was not a story of escape, but of testimony, a final, defiant declaration that while a father may shape a child's world, he cannot, ultimately, own her soul. The terror was never confined to the gulag. Its most intimate theater was the family itself, a stage for total domination. For Svetlana Alliluyeva, the shadow of her father was not a distant political abstraction. It was the suffocating atmosphere of her very existence. By 1967, after decades of relentless state surveillance and a profound emotional erosion, Svetlana would make the most defiant gesture of her life. She would walk away from the Soviet Union. But this was no calculated political maneuver, no grand strategic defection. It was the culmination of a lifetime of grief, of betrayal, of the inexorable burden of being Stalin's daughter. And the final catalyst, the force that broke the dam of a lifetime's containment, was a love she was forbidden to keep. While recovering from a routine surgery, a tonsillectomy, she met a man named Brajesh Singh, a gentle Indian communist visiting Moscow. He was terminally ill with emphysema, a man living on borrowed time, and in him, Svetlana found a warmth and tenderness she had never known. Their affection was mutual and deep. Yet the Soviet authorities, ever the arbiters of private life, refused them permission to marry. The state that had orchestrated the fates of millions would not permit this one small union. When Singh died in 1966, the Kremlin granted Svetlana a single concession. She could travel to India to scatter his ashes in the Ganges. It was her first journey beyond the iron walls of the Soviet sphere. It would also be her last. In the vibrant, chaotic streets of New Delhi, a world away from the grey conformity of Moscow, a decision crystallized. On the 9th of March 1967, Svetlana Alliluyeva walked through the doors of the United States Embassy and made a request that would send shockwaves through the corridors of global power. She asked for political asylum. The American ambassador, Chester Bowles, was plunged into a diplomatic crisis. In a now declassified cable, his astonishment is palpable. "I have a person here," he wrote, "who claims she is Stalin's daughter. I do not know what to do." He was staring at a ghost from the Kremlin, a living relic of the Cold War's most feared figure. Svetlana's response was swift, born of a desperation that left no room for negotiation. If the United States refused her, she would go directly to the press. The threat was clear. The State Department, seeing an unimaginable intelligence and propaganda victory, did not hesitate. That very night, she was spirited onto a plane to Rome, then to Geneva, a clandestine journey toward a new life in the West. Upon her arrival in New York, she faced a ravenous press corps, and there, for the first time, the world heard directly from the daughter of Joseph Stalin, as she publicly disavowed his legacy. "I do not approve of many things," she told the assembled journalists, her voice steady, "but the responsibility for them lies with the communist ideology in general, not just with one person." The timing was freighted with symbolism. The daughter of one of modern history's most monstrous figures was not merely renouncing her father. She was indicting the entire system he had helped forge in blood and iron. For the West, it was a propaganda
Watch people stop watching right here. Bate EF ou continue. ULL discover something almost no one knows.
of the highest order. For Svetlana, it was a moment of profound liberation, but one purchased at an unbearable price. She had left her two older children behind, a son and a daughter, abandoning them to the very system she had fled. It was a wound that would never heal, a source of deep and permanent schism. She wrote to them, a desperate attempt to explain the necessity of her escape, knowing full well they would be weaponized against her, used as instruments of punishment by the Soviet state. Yet she did not waver. In that moment of personal sacrifice and public defiance, the world began to grasp a truth she had known intimately her entire life. Stalin was not simply a leader who made difficult decisions in difficult times. The reality, as seen through the eyes of his own child, was something far more chilling. He was a man who dismantled lives, even those of his own blood, with the cold, methodical precision of an architect. His shadow fell upon everything, even the lives of those who were closest to him. Upon her defection to the United States, Svetlana Alliluyeva was received as both a political symbol and a human curiosity. For a time, she existed within a gilded cage, living under the watchful eye of the Secret Service on Long Island, her days punctuated by lectures at the hushed halls of Princeton University. She sought to define herself through her own words, publishing a memoir, 20 Letters to a Friend. It became an international bestseller, a phenomenon that, by some accounts, brought her a fortune measured in the millions. But the glare of this new world quickly proved to be as blinding as the darkness she had fled. The all-encompassing control of the Soviet system, the very thing she had escaped, was merely replaced by a different, though no less suffocating form of confinement, the West's obsessive fascination with her name. She soon understood a devastating truth. Her value was not as a writer, nor as an intellectual with a unique perspective on the human condition. Her value was as Joseph Stalin's daughter. With each passing year, her disillusionment deepened. She was treated not as a person, but as a walking headline, a relic from a brutal past. I was simply a political prisoner of my father's name, she would later reflect. Wherever she went. In a series of raw, candid letters to the journalist Miriam Gross, Svetlana laid bare her emotional crisis. "I arrived in the West blinded by an admiration for the free world," she wrote. "What a terrible blow to discover that here too there are the same idiots, the same incompetent fools and frightened bureaucrats." This shattering of idealism, she observed, was a bitter rite of passage for so many who has. Her life became a map of restless movement, a search for a place her name could not find her. She lived in New Jersey, then Wisconsin, then crossed an ocean to England, only to return once more. A marriage to the American architect William Wesley Peters was a fleeting attempt at domestic normalcy. It was brief, but from it came a daughter whom she adored, a small anchor in a turbulent sea. In a desperate bid to build a private life, she took the name Lana Peters. But even under this new identity, the shadow of Stalin clung to her, an inescapable inheritance. Her spiritual journey mirrored her physical restlessness. She was drawn to the solemn rituals of the Roman Catholic Church, explored the ancient traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy, and at one point even contemplated the cloistered life of a nun. These were not political statements. They were the private, desperate maneuvers of a soul attempting to find meaning, to reclaim a narrative that had been grotesquely twisted by trauma. Then, in 1984, in a move that stunned the world, Svetlana made a brief, deeply controversial return to the Soviet Union. The authorities, eager to exploit her presence for their own propaganda, rolled out a carpet of promises: apartments, cars, a carefully orchestrated campaign of public rehabilitation. She refused it all. Disenchanted and alienated by the system she had once called home, she returned to the United States just 2 years later. For Svetlana, the West had not offered the redemption she had so desperately craved. It had offered only a different kind of prison. But before her death, she made one point with chilling clarity. Her profound disappointment with both East and West had not altered the fundamental truth she knew about her father. He was not mad. He was not misled. He was a man of cold, deliberate calculation, a master architect of power. This, she insisted, was the one truth the world could not afford to forget. A truth carried from the heart of the Kremlin through a life of exile, a final, chilling whisper against the silence of history. In the final years of her life, Svetlana Alliluyeva existed in a state of near total anonymity. She had settled in the rolling hills of southern Wisconsin, a world away from the granite corridors of power and the ceaseless glare of the world's cameras. It was here, on the 22nd of November 2011, that her life concluded, a quiet surrender to complications from colon cancer. There was no state funeral, no official day of mourning. It was simply a silent end to a life that had once been a symbol of the great global schism, a fault line in human ideology. Yet before the silence fell, she had ensured the world would hear a final testimony. A truth not just about the machinery of Soviet repression, but about the man at its very heart, her father. She meticulously dismantled the comforting theories that Stalin was merely a product of his time, misunderstood, or a man unhinged by paranoia. He knew precisely what he was doing, she wrote. He was neither mad nor misled. With a chillingly clear-eyed calculus, he fortified his power, driven by a fear of losing it that eclipsed all else. Her condemnation was not the fiery rage of a wronged daughter, but the precise clinical assessment of a witness. This detachment made her verdict all the more terrifying. And still, her judgment was not without nuance. Svetlana believed her father had become a convenient monolith, a single figure onto which all the horrors of the Soviet experiment could be projected. A dictator, she insisted, requires accomplices. In her view, Stalin was guilty, but he did not act in a vacuum. His tyranny was enabled by a system that rewarded silence and demanded obedience, a poison that seeped even into the lives of those who knew him best. The man she once called her little papa would never receive her forgiveness.
Wait, this is not the full story.
Through her writings, interviews, and memoirs, she stripped away the myths, revealing the profound personal cost of living within his shadow. Her own existence was the most damning evidence. She would flee nations, abandon children, change names, and embrace poverty, all in a desperate, lifelong quest to sever herself from the man who had once called her his little hostess. In the end, Svetlana never truly found a place to call home. But in that restless journey, she found her voice, and she used it to articulate what no one else could: that Joseph Stalin, architect of a totalitarian state, was also a father who had weaponized love, who had twisted the bonds of family into instruments of control. Her story transcends the cold calculus of geopolitics. It is a chronicle of identity, of betrayal, and of the inescapable gravity of legacy. It is a testament to the idea that even from the deepest shadow, a single voice can emerge to reclaim the truth, reshaping our understanding of history itself.